Hey guys, so this is AP World History, Chapter 18, States and Societies in Sub-Saharan Africa. So today we're going to look at Africa as a whole. We really haven't seen it play a major role in the past few chapters, even really necessarily in the classical time period from 600 BC to 600 CE. So it's kind of coming back again. And today we're going to look at the major impacts that Islam had on it, that trade had on it as well. So let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so the first thing that we see being talked about is this idea of kin-based societies. And what you need to know is that they did not rely on elaborate bureaucracy or hierarchy at the time. So where we've seen in other areas, especially in the Eurasian land areas, where you have like these massive empires and you have this, real government centralization and there's this hierarchy that really didn't occur necessarily so much in Africa, and you won't see it until later on with the development of like the Mali Empire. The Bantus, if you remember them, they're the ones that kind of traveled all over the place. Once they got way too populated, they would move from place to place and reestablish themselves. They would govern themselves through family and kinship groups. So it's pretty much like maybe 100 people lived in a village, and the males of the families were like the kind of the ones in charge, and so they would be the chief, and then they would have these ruling councils that would be the male heads of the families, and they were the ones that made the decisions on anything that was related to that village, whether it be in terms of family and or extended kinship. But again, there was no social hierarchy, no elaborate bureaucracy. You also had the groups of villages that would eventually turn into districts. But once again, there's no main chief of this districts or a government for this district. It was kind of like, hey, send your male chief representative, send your male chief representative, and let's kind of, if there's an issue, let's kind of fix it. So that's pretty much what the kin-based society was. Later on, though, we're going to see the development of chiefdoms because conflicts between different villages and districts will arise, and the development of militaries on a larger scale will arise for the protection and defense of their own villages or districts. So as this is happening, you're going to see that many districts will fall under the rule of powerful chiefs, and that will overrun the rule of kinship groups. So it's kind of like you have to think of it as it's growing. Okay, so you start with your little kin-based society in your village, and that gets big, so it becomes a district. And the conflicts that you have between one district to another is going to lead to the development of chiefdoms, and those chiefdoms, they will have rulers with them. So it consolidated small conquered lands into these kingdoms because of the chiefdoms. So one of the first kingdoms we see is the Kingdom of Congo, and it is the most active area of political development for the time. It's one of the first ones that really came out of all these pressures that we saw with the conflicts between districts and stuff. So population pressure and military challenges encouraged kin-based societies to form these small states, such as the Kingdom of Congo. Once they began to develop, obviously they're going to be larger in terms of who they're taking care of, in terms of land. So this would lead them to participate in trade networks. So this is pretty much how the government ran for the Kingdom of Congo. You had the king, and then there were the officials, which were for military, judicial, and financial affairs. And then under the officials, you had the governors who were in charge of the various provinces that were within the kingdom. And then under those governors, you had subordinate officials who were in charge of those districts that we talked about. And then again, under them, you see the chiefs who are in charge of the local government and also the royal currency. So even though in the beginning we see the kin-based societies, we see it obviously develop to something more elaborate as you had more military pressure, more social pressure, more conflicts arise. You saw the need to develop a better, I guess, kind of bureaucracy. The next thing we're going to look at is camels. I know it's kind of odd to be talking about an animal playing a significant role in history, but they really did, especially for the kingdoms and empires of Africa. So they use camels because it quickened the pace of transportation and communication. And they are not native to Africa. They actually come from Arabia and they came about the 7th century. And they will replace horses and donkeys. And they will replace them, yes, because of the quickened pace in transportation, but also because camels could go longer distances without water. So it only made sense if they're, traveling in the desert for them to have a camel, which they know they're not going to have to stop so many times for instead of having a horse. So it made sense for them to have camels, and through the use of these camels, it was able to increase trade. So the next kingdom we're going to look at is the kingdom of Ghana, and this is probably one of the more well-known kingdoms in West Africa. So it arises in the 4th and 5th century as a regional state, but it's important because it's a commercial site in West Africa. And really, the way that this kingdom gets their power, their wealth, is through the taxation of trade. So Kumbe Salah is the capital of Ghana, and here we see the buildings, mosques, the large armies. And like I said, it's the center for trade in gold. Not only that, it is where they see the beginning of the gold salt trade. That is extremely, extremely important to remember, this gold salt trade. And it is exactly the way it sounds. You are trading gold for salt. Okay? Um, and that is important because salt is a commodity at this time. And salt, if you know what salt does, it preserves food, which means it's going to last longer. And that is important, especially if you're a traveler. So it becomes very important. And like I said, they controlled and taxed trade of gold, helped strengthen their realm because of this taxation of gold and of trade. And then other exports that they sent out from the Kingdom of Ghana would be ivory and slaves, and we'll get into slavery in a bit. And then things that they would bring in: horses, cloth, manufactured goods, and of course, I just talked to you about the importance of the salt. So just again, keep that in mind. This time period that we're looking at, this is the gold salt trade during this time. Very important to remember. So Islam in West Africa is going to play a huge role. Islam is going to play a huge role pretty much in all of West Africa and in most of Africa except for the eastern part, specifically the Kingdom of Axum, but we'll get into that later. In terms of West Africa, kings of Ghana converted to Islam, and it improved the relations with Muslim merchants from North Africa as well as nomads. You need to think that it's just easier. It's just easier when you have things in common. And Islam was that thing that merchants would have in common. So it meant that you were probably going to trade more with, certain merchants, and you were going to get along easier with them. So conversion was going to bring recognition and support, and it was also going to bring in trade as well. So it's not like they didn't believe in Islam or they didn't practice it in terms of being spiritual about it. They did. The people there did, faithfully believe in Islam, but there was also that commercial purpose for it as well. So raids weakened the kingdom and it soon collapsed. So the kingdom of Ghana, because of the raiding that it was experiencing, will fall. And political leadership will fall to the Mali Empire, which will be the next empire, or which will be the empire to rise after the kingdom of Ghana. So Sundiata, he was the one who established and built the Mali Empire for the first half of the 13th century. And he did this by making alliances with local rulers, local people. And once he was able to establish these alliances, he earned that reputation of courage, and he had this large army and cavalry. So, because of those reasons, of having those alliances, people knowing that he was courageous, being able to have a rather large army, then he was able to establish the Mali Empire. And of course, once again, they're benefiting from the trans Saharan trade. okay, also known as the gold salt trade. Again, keep those two words in mind: trans-Saharan trade, gold salt trade. They are pretty much the same thing. Um, and obviously, if it's happening in the Sahara Desert, then that's where the trade is happening. Also, you see the controlled and tax trade in West Africa as well. So similar, absolutely similar to the Kingdom of Ghana. That's the same way that they made their money, was that they controlled and taxed the trade that was going on within their empire. Um, as we see that these West African kingdoms, like the Kingdom of Ghana, they convert to Islam, the same thing here in Mali. They honored Islam and they provided people who were there with protection, lodging, and comforts to Muslim merchants from the north. So it's really like you're um, satisfying the needs of especially your Muslim merchants. And this again really helps to establish good commercial relationships, which would make sense in order to bring more wealth into your empire. So Islam in East Africa now, we see the conversion to Islam in East Africa was going to bring cooperation with Muslim merchants along the Indian Ocean basin. So the West, we see it happening with the gold salt trade through the trans-Saharan desert. Moving to the East, along the Indian Ocean basin, we're going to see again something similar where because we're both Muslim, it's going to be just easier to trade. So that cooperation was important. And again, the conversion brings the legitimacy, the recognition, and the political alliances with other Muslim leaders. It's just one of those things where it's a win-win all around, if in terms of politics, in terms of commercial trade, in terms of society. So the next thing we're going to look at is the cultural and social developments. We're going to see the age grades. So individuals in a community within a given age group, this is pretty much saying that like if you're between the age of 14 and 15, then this particular task is the task that you're going to do for your age grade. All right, and we see it arise in Sudan. And like I said, you're performing tasks appropriate to your age and development. And so sometimes it could be like, okay, you guys are between the ages of 18 and 20, then you have this project that you need to build. You guys are from the ages of 14 to 17, then you're going to take care of the elderly. So it was good to form that because it was helping each other in terms of adversity and challenges. You had that group to rely on, your same people in your same group. And again, creating that bond among the group. But that's what the age grades were. So, like I said, we would come into slavery, we would talk about slavery in Africa. So, during this time, slaves were considered captives of war, debtors, suspected criminals. They worked as agricultural laborers and construction laborers, miners, or porters. And this was a sign of wealth in sub Saharan Africa. And the reason that it's a sign of wealth was because they did not recognize property, meaning land property. Remember, they're kin based society, so they're pretty much sharing land within their community, within their village. So they're not saying, no, this is my land, this is your land. So the way that they were able to show their wealth was by having slaves. So we see a form of wealth in sub Saharan Africa. And they use this, but wealth was used, and they used it for trade. So they also traded slaves as well. The northern lands traded with the slaves with sub-Saharan Africa, and because slavery was seen as this form of wealth, the more slaves you had, obviously the wealthier you were, then people began to have these slave raids where they would go into other tribes and take people to capture them and sell them as slaves. In addition to that, we also see on the eastern part Muslim merchants coming in and buying these slaves as well. So slave raiding became prominent, leading to wars among states and kin-based societies. Because it was like, oh, you're taking people from my village to be a slave. Well, I'm going to take somebody from your village to be a slave. So that creates more conflict between these small based kin-based societies. So I guess, again, it's important to note that slavery existed before this time. Okay, slavery existed when we look at the Romans, when we look at the Greeks, and they were always usually prisoners of war, debtors, that kind of thing. What makes this different is that now people are raiding each other to sell each other off as slaves. Before, it wasn't that they were selling them, it was more that had just captured them because, again, prisoners of war, debtors, what have you. Now it's shifted, and again, since it's that form of wealth, then people are going to want to buy them. So we see the shift happen in the terms of the capture and the selling of them because the idea already existed of slavery. And again, we see it happening within themselves, first in Africa, and then a little bit later, the Muslim merchants will come in. And then after the Muslim merchants, we see the Europeans come in and take them into the Americas. So just important to note that it was not the Americans that started the, or it was not the Europeans that started this idea of slavery at a cost. Okay, so we're going to move on to the African religion with the diviners. They were religious specialists and they were intelligent people and they understood the political, social, and economics of their community. So it wasn't necessarily, a theological thing where it's like, okay, this is so religion based, these diviners. It was more so that they were trying to learn the cause of misfortunes. Why were things happening in this world? And so what these diviners would do is they would consult the oracle, kind of like that middle person between them and the god, and they would prescribe the necessary remedy based on what they would think the oracle was saying. So it was more focused on controlling the experiences of the world and emphasizing morality and proper behavior. Kind of saying, well, you lost your crops because you were not proper behaving properly at this point. And had you done that, then you would have had a good harvest. So it was more for that purpose than anything else. And then kinship groups would take responsibility for those who misbehaved. So it was really like, okay, this person in our family misbehaved. We as a group, as a family, needed to fix that. So the next thing we're going to look at is the arrival of Christianity and Islam. So, like I told you, Christianity was really only seen in East Africa, especially in the Kingdom of Africa. In the Kingdom of Axum, sorry. It reached Egypt and North Africa throughout the Mediterranean basin, which makes sense because if you look at it geographically, the Mediterranean is on the northern part of Africa. Alexandria was a prominent area of Christianity, and probably the most well known kingdom was the Kingdom of Axum, and it's the location of modern Ethiopia. So it's really important that you remember this kingdom, the Kingdom of Axum. Um, Again, modern location Ethiopia. Again, located East Africa. Okay, because it's probably the only time where you're going to see a heavy development of Christianity in that area until the arrival of the Europeans who begin to convert them. Other than that, it's pretty much Islam all the way everywhere except for this area. So they were the first converts were probably local merchants in hope of improving relations with neighbors to the north, obviously where the religion came from. And it reflects the larger political experience of the region. Again, this idea of geopolitics where, okay, people in the north, they're following it. So obviously us on the east, and we're going to trade with them. Again, let's have something in common and let's do this. Let's trade because we're Christian. Reflects, like I said, reflects the larger political experience of the region. The 7th century, Axum fell to Islam, but during the 12th century to 16th century, it will rise again with a new kind of family who's in charge, bringing it back up and establishing mosques and everything like that. So Ethiopia's Salamic dynasty will claim ancestry from David and Solomon and Kebra Nagast, who it's a fictional work. They will trace the lineage, and that's really how Ethiopia will connect to Christianity. So Ethiopian Christianity retained the basic Christian theology and rituals. Pretty much they're believing in the same things, but they also kept some of the religious beliefs that they had before they adopted Christianity. Some of their native beliefs of evil spirits, and they would carry amulets and charms for protection, and that fell under like the native religion. In terms of Africa and Islam, it reflected, of course, the interests of the local converts. Islam kept a place for sub-Saharan African traditions and beliefs. So Islam in Africa accommodated to proper relations between the sexes, and it supplemented rather than replaced traditional religions in sub-Saharan Africa. So here's the thing about Islam and Africa, because it's very different than Islam in any other place that we see it spread into India, Southeast Asia, any part of Southwest Asia as well. Um, it was less strict in Africa, meaning that women were not necessarily like having to cover up everything, having to be, totally in the hands of the male and stuff like that. It was more, free actually. Women didn't dress as conservative as you would see them in others. So it was almost like they had Islam, but they didn't practice everything about it. Okay, they believed in all of the doctrine and stuff like that, but in terms of the behavior and the way they showed it, it was very different than all the other places where Islam spread. And that's super important to note that, because that's probably a significant difference. The gender roles were very different at that time. All right, so that's pretty much it for Africa. Again, keep in mind the importance that trade played, the gold salt trade that you see, the importance Islam played, not only in terms of the religion itself, but how it affected the business side of it, the commercial side of it. Then we see how Christianity also came in, and you just kind of see it on that eastern part, the idea of slavery, how it started, and how it became something of value by selling people off to others. So just keep all those things in mind, and we will see you next time.